How's it going, my bakers? Hope you're having a great day. Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you some tips on how to tell whether your bread is ready or not. So let's go to the kitchen and check it out. The ability to tell whether a bread is fully baked or not comes with experience. It's a combination of the crust being the right color, the weight of the loaf, and even the sound of it. Of course, it's easy to tell when you cut it open, but by that time, it's already too late. The more you bake, the sooner you will develop a feel for it. I made this video to get you on the right track from the get-go. We'll make 3 types of bread today. We'll bake them for different times and see how they turn out. Starting with 3 pan loaves. I'm using a cold fermented dough, and it will be the same dough used in our 3 experiments. I'll give the loaves a good spray of water to give them best chance of rising. We'll get them in the oven all at the same time. Usually I would bake a loaf like this for around 40 minutes, and one of them will be baked for 40 minutes. The first one though will be coming out after just 25 minutes. There is definitely not enough time for such a large loaf. But if we were to judge these by the top crust color, even just after 25 minutes, it's quite brown already. But while the surface may be cooked, the middle will be raw. There is one sure way of telling when your bread's done, without any skill. Just stick a probe in it. This is great for the beginner, because if it reads above 94 degrees Celsius, it is ready. But as you saw, this one was nowhere close. And when I lift it up, it also feels quite heavy. Not enough of the moisture has baked out of it. Let's listen to it. The tapping test can be helpful, but it's only useful if you have used it many times before. So when you bake your bread, you should do this every single time. Tap it, lift it, hold it, remember the crust color, and over time, you'll start to be able to piece everything together. Okay, so this loaf baked for 40 minutes, and as we can see, it has reached the correct temperature. Above 94 degrees Celsius or 200 Fahrenheit is a standard for pretty much any bread. But let's give this one a quick listen too. It does sound a little bit more hollow. Of course, the microphone doesn't pick it up very well. Let's see what happens to our final loaf. I let the crust burn on purpose. It is clearly overdone, but let's check its temperature. 99 degrees, and that's pretty high. If your bread reaches over 100 degrees in the middle, it will be pretty much burnt on the outside. Right, let's unwrap it and give it a few taps, see what it sounds like. Or hear what it sounds like, I should say. It does feel a bit lighter than the other two. And yeah, sound-wise, it is kinda more hollow, but it's hard to tell the difference between the second one and the third one. Okay, the second test will be on some rolls. We'll bake the first one for 10 minutes, the second one for 20 minutes, and the final one for 35 minutes. Clearly 10 minutes is nowhere near enough. I would normally bake this kind of roll for around 20 to 25 minutes, depending on the temperature. So after 20 minutes, the second roll has a nice crust color, and it feels a lot lighter than the first one. The final roll is quite a bit darker, but it's not burnt, but the crust will definitely be quite crispy. Right, one final test. This time we're making flatbreads. And of course, after all this, we'll cut them all open and see what's inside. Flatbreads like these cook very quickly. If your oven is hot enough, if you're cooking them on a grill, they could take just a minute. I would normally bake these on the highest temperature setting in my oven for around 3 minutes. But we'll bake the first one for 1 minute, the second one for 3 minutes, and the final one for 6 minutes. Basically, the first one's coming out just as soon as it puffs up. For the second one, we're just waiting for the first signs of color on the crust. Normally, that's a good indicator of a flatbread being fully baked. The longer you bake it, the drier it gets. And I know it's tempting to bake your bread until it's nice and brown all over. But when it comes to flatbreads, lots of color may mean that they are overbaked. That is of course not a rule. Right, there we have them in order. Our first pale flatbread, the second slightly more colored one and more puffed up one, and the third one with lots of color. More color means better flavor, of course. But before we get to our flatbreads, let's check our loaves. It is impossible to tell you what your bread should look like when it's fully baked. It depends on what kind of bread you're baking, what temperature you're baking it at, and what kind of oven you're baking it in. Just because it's pale on the outside doesn't mean it's not cooked in the middle. Just because it's very dark on the outside, perhaps getting close to burnt, doesn't mean that it's overbaked inside. There is such a thing as baking your bread dark. I mean, this of course is overbaked. The crust is burnt, but you could get pretty close to this and have a perfectly good bread. It is up to your taste really, but obviously when it comes to anyone's taste, this bread is definitely not fully baked. This is not edible, it's raw dough. A loaf of bread of medium to large size will take at least 30, 35 minutes, 40 minutes to fully bake, no matter the temperature. As I pressed it, it just turned back into a dough ball. The 40-minute bake one is nice and springy, just how it should be. But what about the one that we baked for 1 hour? I would say it's perfectly fine. Even though it baked for 20 minutes longer and the crust was burnt, it's totally fine in the middle. And the burning of the top crust is mostly the fault of my oven. It only has a heating element on the top and it's quite aggressive. In a different oven, I could have easily baked this bread for 1 hour and had a perfectly fine loaf. Because I actually prefer a darker crust. It has a more intense flavor. I guess the main lesson here is that it's pretty difficult to over-bake a large loaf of bread. It can be underbaked though. But let's have a look at the rolls. They tell a similar story. The one on the left is obviously raw. The one in the middle has a nice color, it feels nice and light, and the one on the right is a lot darker, a lot crustier and crispier, but it will be perfectly fine on the inside. So one of the best ways of telling when your bread is ready is by looking at the crust. If it's nicely browned all over, it's done. Unless you're baking it very close to the heating element. But that makes no sense. You should bake your bread on the lower or middle shelf of the oven. And as you can see, even with the rolls, the one that was baked for 35 minutes, a time that I would never bake a roll for, the crumb is still nice and springy. It's not dry at all. Of course, more moisture baked out of it, and it might stale sooner than a roll baked for 20 minutes. But if you like a crusty roll like this, and if you want to eat it right away, there's nothing wrong with baking it for 35 minutes. Or you could just bake it on a higher temperature to begin with. If you're not making your own recipes, and you're just following mine for instance, then it's simple. You just bake the bread for the time I tell you to bake it for. That is one good way of telling when it's ready. Of course your oven may be slightly different, and it's up to each of us to learn how our oven bakes. You may need to repeat the bake a couple times to really dial it in. And if you are unsure, the temperature probe is your best friend. It does not lie. When it comes to flatbreads, you can't really take the temperature of them. The best thing to look for when making them is color. As soon as they start browning, they are most likely done. Breads like these should be baked on the highest temperature possible. They need a quick and hot bake, because the more time they spend in the oven, the more they will dry out. But once again, the doneness is also up to preference. If you want more browning, you want more flavor in the crust, you can bake it for longer. Just be aware that it will be slightly drier and it will stale sooner. But I guess it doesn't matter if you're gonna eat them right away, because there's no point in storing flatbread. That thing should be eaten right away. Okay, the insides here tell the same story as before. This is totally underbaked. When I press it, it just turns back into dough. There's no spring in it. The other two will be nice and springy, just like they should be. I guess once again I've showed you what the bread should look like after the fact. But that is the only way to learn. You bake it, you check it, and if need be, next time you adjust it. You should always feel your bread, lift it, handle it, tap it. And even if it doesn't make any sense in the beginning, over time it will become clearer. You will feel the difference between the loaf you placed in the oven and between the one you took out. You will hear the hollowness of it when you tap it. And you should use the temperature probe alongside those tests, because that will give you a confirmation. And once you get enough experience, you won't need to use it anymore. But I must admit though, I use it quite often when making rye bread, because those things are so dense, only temperature probe tells me when they're fully baked. I guess I haven't baked enough to be able to tell yet. So how do you tell when your bread is ready? Have you ever tried using your temperature probe? Let me know down in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this one, click over here. Subscribe to the channel, click right here. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.